Hello. This presentation critically explored the gradual erosion of Polluter-pay principle within the context of developing economies, with a particular emphasis on India. Despite the presence of the robust regulatory framework and the judicial endorsement of the principle, the practical enforcement of the Polluter-pay principle often remain inconsistent and ineffective. Hello and welcome again. I am your host Harshit Sinha. Moving towards the final segment of our series, we turn our attention to the pressing concern for the fall of the Polluter-pay principle in the developing countries, with India serving as a central case study. In this session, we delve into the economic, political, and social factors that undermine the successful application of Polluter-pay principles. This includes institutional weakness, limited financial and technical resources, regulatory capture, and prioritizing of economic growth over the environmental safeguards. Many industrial violators exploit these systematic vulnerability, often evading accountability through legal loopholes or political influence. We will also scrutinize India's existing environmental governance structure, examine its fragmentation across multiple agencies, and the limited deterrent effect of penalties currently being imposed. Through a series of illustrative case studies across varied industrial sectors, chemical, mining, and the manufacturing, we will highlight how enforcement failures have allowed polluters to act with impunity. Ultimately, the presentation aims to propose realistic policy intervention that strike a balance between the sustainable development and environmental protection. We emphasize the need for capacity building, community participation, and institutional reforms to enhance transparency and accountability. This analysis aspires to serve as a roadmap towards revive polluter-pay principle in a global south, particularly under the India's unique development challenges. Let us first discuss what are the flaws in the polluter-pay principle. The implementation of the Polluter-pay principle in India encountered several critical challenges that hinders its effectiveness. The first one is ambiguity in defining polluter. The term polluter lacks a precise legal definition, leading to difficulties in pinpointing liabilities. Environmental degradation often results from the cumulative action of multiple entities, making it challenging to attribute responsibility to a single source. This vagueness can result in regulatory gaps and inconsistent enforcement. Next is related to the burden on poor communities. In certain instances, the enforcement of polluter-pay principle inadvertently impact economically disadvantaged communities. For example, when informal settlements are deemed responsible for environmental harm, imposing penalties without providing viable alternative can exacerbate their socio-economic hardship. Such scenarios highlight the need for equitable application of polluter-pay principle that consider the capacity of vulnerable populations. Next is related with the impact of small businesses. Small and medium-sized businesses, SMEs, often operate with limited financial and technical resources. Stringent enforcement of polluter-pay principle can impose substantial compliance costs on these businesses, potentially hindering their growth or leading to closure. This underscores the necessity for a balanced approach that supports environmental objectives while accommodating the constraints of smaller enterprises. And the last is related with the export competitiveness. Industries in developing countries like India may face increased production of cost due to the polluter compliance affecting their competitiveness in international market. Higher operational expenses can lead to elevated product prices, making India exports less attractive compared to the counterparts of the countries. With more lenient environmental regulation, the situations call for harmonized global environmental standards to ensure a level playing field. Now let us explore the potential misapplications. The implementation of Polluter-pay principle in India while aimed at promoting the environmental accountability, has encountered several misapplications that undermine its effectiveness. The first one is related with the suppressing legitimate activity. There are an instance where Polluter-pay principle has been misused to hinder lawful economic activities. For example, certain industrial projects, despite adhering to the environmental regulation, have faced undue penalties under the guise of Polluter-pay principle. This misapplication not only discourages investment but also hampers economic growth as business may become wary for unpredictable regulatory action. The next is related with the arbitrary definition. The lack of clear definitions of what constitutes a polluter and the extent of pollution has led to inconsistent enforcement of polluter-pay principle. This ambiguity allows for subjective interpretation where similar activities might receive disparate penalties. Such inconsistency can erode trust in environmental regulations and create an unpredictable business environment. The next and the last is related with the political agendas. The application of polluter-pay principle has at a time been influenced by the political consideration rather than environmental objective. Certain industries or projects may be targeted or exempted based on the political affiliations or the pressures leading to selective enforcement. This not only undermines the principal integrity but also raise concern about the fairness and transparency in the environmental governance. Another important factor is related with the enforcement imperfections in the environmental liabilities. Despite the constitutional recognition of the environmental protection under the Article 48A and Article 51AG, the enforcement of the environmental liabilities in India faces several critical shortcomings. The first is related with a major concern is insolvency of the polluters, particularly small-scale industries and unincorporated entities, which often lack the financial capacity to remediate the damage they cause. This frequently results in state bearing the burden, undermining the essence of the polluter-pay principle. The other factor is related with the court delay. The court delay exacerbated the problem. The backlog of the environmental cases in India, courts including the National Green Tribunal, that is NGT, dilutes timely justice and weakness regulatory efficacy. For instance, legal proceeding in a high-profile case like the LG Polymers gas leak in 2020 demonstrate how protracted hearing can delay reinstitutions and affects victim rehabilitation. The other is diluted deterrence is another consequences of weak enforcement, nominal penalties and infrequent conviction fails to dissuade industries from violating environmental norms. And the last is related with the additional judicial uncertainty in interpreting the liability provisions create inconsistency legal precedents. Courts sometimes struggle with defining the extent of liability, especially in the absence of scientific clarity or when jurisdictional overlap between the state agency arises. While the legal framework appears robust under law like Environmental Protection Act of 1986 and judicial doctrine such as absolute liability, their enforcement is undermined by systematic inefficiencies. For India to effectively uphold polluter-pay principle and environmental justice, institutional reforms ensuring financial accountability, expedite adjudications, and legal clarity are imperative. Now we shall discuss what are the political obstacles to implementation. Implementing effective environmental policy in India is hindered by the several political challenges. The first one is related with the regulatory capture. This occurs when industry influences regulatory agency meant to oversee them, leading to compromised enforcement of environmental law. In India, such captures has resulted in lenient penalties and overlooked violation, undermining the deterrent effects of regulation. The next is related with the federalism challenges. India's federal structure divided environmental responsibility between the central and the state government. However, this division often leads to conflicts and inefficiency. For example, recent regulatory changes in the mining sector have reduced state autonomy, causing tension over the resource management and environmental oversight. The next is related with the short-term political cycles. The focus on immediate electoral gain often sidelines long-term environmental planning. Politicians may prioritize projects with a quick, visible benefits over the sustainable initiative that requires time to yield results. This short-termism hampers the development and implementation of comprehensive environment strategies. Let us now discuss what are the institutional weaknesses. India's efforts to enforce environmental accountability are significantly hampered by the deep-rooted institutional weakness. The first is related with the fragmented regulatory framework. That is, a major challenge is the fragmented regulatory framework where the responsibilities are split between the various ministries, State Pollution Control Board and the central agencies, often leading to overlapping jurisdictions and regulatory confusion. The lack of unified environmental code contributes to inefficiencies and inconsistent enforcement across states. The next is capacity constraints that are equally problematic. Most state pollution control boards are underfunded and understaffed, lacking the human and the financial resources necessary for effective environmental monitoring and compliance check. This is particularly evident in the inability to regularly inspect polluting industries or enforcing penalties for violation. The next is related with the India also suffers from limited scientific infrastructure. Monitoring air and water quality, assessing cumulative ecological impact, and conducting real-time pollution tracking requires advanced technology and skilled personnel, both of which are insufficiently developed in many regions. The reliance on outdated monitoring tools undermines the regulatory effectiveness. The next is related further procedural bottlenecks such as the bureaucratic delay, inadequate coordination between agencies, and the lengthy environmental clearance processes slow down the both industrial development and regulatory action. These systematic issues reduce deterrence and embolden violators. Thus, the strengthening India's institutional capacity for environmental governance is essential to ensure the effective application of principles like polluter-pay and safeguard ecological integrity. Now let us look at the broader aspect how impact of economic liberalization is affecting. India's economic liberalization initiated in 1991 marked a transformative shift from the state-controlled economy to a market-oriented one. This structural transition has significantly impacted the industrial, social and environmental landscape of the country. The first is pre-1991 limited industry development. Prior to liberalization, India followed a protectionist model with a strong state intervention. The license Raj imports substitution policy and the state monopolies restricted private sector growth and the foreign investment. Industrial development was slow, often hampered by bureaucratic red tape, inefficiencies, and lack of global competitiveness. The next is era between 1991 to 2000. Initial liberalization phase. Faced with the balance of the payment crisis, India opened up its economy under the leadership of then Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. The key reforms included the reduction of import tariff, deregulation of industries, and encouragement of foreign direct investment, that is FDI. The private sector began to flourish and sectors like information technology and telecommunication expanded rapidly. However, environmental regulations were often sidelined in favor of industrial growth. The next is related with 2000 and the present time with the escalated growth phase. India emerges as one of the fastest growing economies globally. The services and the manufacturing sector expanded significantly and the country became more integrated with the global trade network. However, rapid urbanization and industrialization brought ecological challenges including pollution, deforestation, and resource depletion. The environmental governance framework have struggled to keep pace with the growth trajectory. While the liberalization has undoubtedly boosted the economic indicators and reduced poverty, its uneven impact across sectors and regions have raised concern about the sustainable development. The need for the balanced policy that integrate growth with the environmental and the social justice remain a central challenge in the post-liberalization era of India. Now let us see what are the legal framework limitations. India's environmental legal framework through extensive suffers from several structural limitations that hinders the effectiveness applications of the Polluter-pay principle. One key issue is inadequacy of the penalties structures. Penalties under the legacy law such as the Environmental Protection Act of 1986 or Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act of 1974 are often outdated and insufficient to deter large-scale corporate violators. In many cases, fines are minimal compared to the cost of compliance, reducing the incentive to adopt pollution control measures. The burden of proof challenges further complicate enforcement. The legal requirement for the regulatory or the petitioner to establish causation between a specific polluter's action and environmental harm is often difficult due to insufficient monitoring, lack of real-time data, and scientific complexity. This delays proceedings and undermines the accountability. Additionally, limited liability mechanisms allow corporate entities to escape full financial responsibility. The legal system lacks robust provision for a strict or absolute liabilities in many environmental cases, especially when the damage is extended over the long duration or affects marginalized communities, while the Supreme Court has upheld the principle of absolute liability in cases like MC Mehta versus Union of India. Implementation remains inconsistent. Collectively, if we see, these legal limitations dilute deterrence and reduce the efficacy of the environmental protection efforts in India. Strengthening the framework with a clear liability rulers, higher penalties, and the better access to justice mechanism is essential for meaningful implementation of Polluter-pay principle. Now let us explore the impact of information asymmetry problems. Information asymmetry presents a major obstacle to the effective enforcement of environmental governance in India. It occurs when key stakeholders, particularly affected communities, lack access to reliable, timely, and accurate environmental information. Community knowledge barriers are prevalent, especially in the rural and the pre-urban areas where population are often unaware of industrial activities, their pollutant emission, or the potential health and ecological risks involved. Limited environmental literacy, inadequate public consultation mechanism, and the language barrier further prevent communities from participating meaningfully in environmental decision making. Disclosure limitations are another concern. While laws like the Environmental Impact Assessment EIA notification of 2006 mandate some levels of disclosure, compliance remains weak and disclosure are often vague, highly technical or delayed. Companies tend to underreport environmental risk and enforcement agencies rarely compel full transparency. Strategic misinformation is used by some industries to mislead regulators and the public. Corporations may commission biased impact studies, manipulate baseline data, or suppresses negative findings. Without independent verification system or real-time environmental monitoring, regulators often accept such reports at face value. And the last one is related with the India's traditional compliance approaches, focused on the procedural checklist rather than the performance-based outcome. Further compounds this issue. Inspections are infrequent and predictable, and enforcement agencies lack both the technical capacity and autonomy to critically evaluate the complex environmental data. This slide discusses one of the most important topics, that is the valuation challenges. The accurate valuation of the environmental damage in India presents formidable challenges that hinders effective implementation of the Polluter-pay principle and broader environmental justice goals. These challenges stem from a combination of legal, economic, and scientific institutional limitation. The damage assessment complexity lies at the heart of the environmental valuation challenges. Unlike the traditional economic losses, environmental damages such as loss of biodiversity, ecological degradation, or long-term soil and the water contamination are not always immediately observable or measurable. For instance, in cases like that Bhopal gas tragedy or the LG polymers leak, quantifying the health and the ecological damage took years and remained uncontested. India still lacks a standard framework for ecosystem services valuation, which affects consistent and timely enforcement of the liabilities. The other is related with the intergenerational equity. That is, intergenerational equity, although recognized by the Indian judiciary in cases like Valued Citizen Welfare Forum versus Union of India in 1996, remain difficult to apply in valuation practice. Most environmental damage has long-term effect, and the inability to account for impact on the future generation lead to underestimation of true environmental cost. The next is related with the economic methodology limitation further complicate matters. Traditional cost-benefit analysis often fails to capture non-market value such as cultural loss, displacement, or health impact. Techniques like contingent valuation and the hedonic pricing are still underutilized or poorly adapted to Indian socio-economic context. In the absence of the robust data and the economic valuation model, regulatory bodies struggle to leave meaningful penalties. Other is related with the scientific uncertainty that adds another layer of difficulty. Causal link between the pollutants and the environmental outcome are complex with a multiple contributing factor. For example, in air pollution related litigation, providing which emission source cause a specific health issue is scientifically demanding. Moreover, lack of localized data and the weak monitoring mechanism further limits conclusive assessment. Together, these challenges result in a weak enforcement of environmental liabilities under compensation of affected communities and erosion of public trust in regulatory systems. Addressing them requires multidisciplinary collaboration, investment in scientific and economic research, and reform of a legal framework to accommodate uncertainty and intergenerational risks. Now we shall discuss some case studies. The first one is related with the textile industries in Tamil Nadu. The textile industries in Tamil Nadu, particularly concentrated in Tirupur, is one of the largest in India, contributing significantly to export and employment. However, this industrial hub has also been associated with a severe environmental degradation, especially related to water pollution. The unchecked discharge of effluent into the Noel River over decades caused immense damage to water bodies and agriculture and public health. The scale of impact. The Tripur houses over 2,000 textile units, which include dyeing and bleaching industries. These units generate large volume of wastewater heavily contaminated with hazardous chemical dyes and heavy metals. The cumulative discharge of untreated effluent significantly affect downstream districts like Erode and Kurur, damaging the soil fertility and the crop yields. The other is related with the environmental damage. The most viable consequences was the pollution of Noel River, once a lifeline of agriculture in the region. Studies revealed dangerously high level of total dissolved solids, that is TDS, heavy metals and other pollutants in the river. This led to groundwater contamination and the loss of over 30,000 hectares of cultivable land, rendering it barren. Farmers' livelihoods were severely impacted and public health concerns increased due to toxic exposure. The next is judicial intervention. In 2011, the Madras High Court ordered the closure of approximately 700 dyeing units that failed to install zero liquid discharge system. The court held the polluting industry accountable for the environmental damage and ordered them to compensate the affected farmers. It emphasized the polluter-pay principle drawing from the earlier Supreme Court judgments such as Vellore Citizen Welfare Forum versus Union of India in 1996. The Tamil Nadu Pollution Control Board was directed to strictly monitor compliance. The court also underscored that economic progress cannot be achieved at the cost of environmental sustainability. The next is related with the industry response. Following the judicial pressure, many units implemented ZLD, that is Zero Liquid Discharge system, and adopted cleaner technology. Common Effluent Treatment Plant, that is CETP, were developed under cluster-based models. However, compliance remained inconsistent, especially among the smaller units due to the higher operational costs. Some units resorted to illegal discharge to cut costs, necessitating ongoing vigilance. This case underscores the critical role of judicial activism in enforcing environmental accountability and the challenges of balancing industrial growth with the ecological sustainability. Another case study is related with the mining in Goa. The industrial profile. Goa is one of India's richest states in terms of iron ore reserves and has historically been a major exporter, especially to China and Japan. The state's mining sector largely centered around iron ore extraction, once contributed nearly 30% of Goa's GDP and provided employment to thousands. With over 300 active leases in the early 2000s, the sector played a key role in local economic. However, this economic activity came at the steep environmental cost. The next is related now with the environmental violation. Widespread illegal mining exceeding permissible extraction limit, unregulated dumping of waste, and encroachment on forest land became rampant from the mid-2000s. Reports revealed that mining activities were being conducted without environmental clearance and the forest law were being routinely violated. The Justice M.B. Shah Commission in 2012 found that nearly Rs 35,000 crores worth of illegal mining had occurred in the state with grave environmental and regulatory lapse. Environmental degradation include deforestation, loss of biodiversity, soil erosion, and the contamination of the rivers like the Mondiv and the Zuria due to sedimentation and the chemical runoff. Aquifers were disrupted and agricultural land was dumped by mining sludge. The other is now related with the regulatory response. In the response of the Shah Commission finding, the Supreme Court of India in 2012 suspended all mining operations in Goa pending further investigation. In 2014, the court allowed resumption under the strict regulation limiting extraction and mandating fresh environmental clearance. However, in a landmark 2018 judgment, the Supreme Court quashed 88 renewed mining leases, citing non-compliance with the environmental norms and procedural violation under the Mining and Mineral Development and Regulation Act of 1957 and the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. And the last, we are dealing with the environmental challenges. Despite judicial intervention, Goa continues to face challenges in balancing ecological sustainability with the economic interests. The mining ban significantly impacted livelihoods, yet restarting the operations under the improved regulatory oversight remained contentious. Concern about the illegal mining, inadequate monitoring, and the political lobbying persist. Restoration of mined land, reclamation of the forest area, and the rehabilitation of the affected communities remain incomplete, highlighting the limitation of enforcement in India environmental governance. Now let us see the informal sector pollution, how it has affected Polluter-pay principle. The first is now related with the electronic waste recycling in India. India generates over 1.6 million tons of electronic waste, that is e-waste, annually, making it one of the largest producers globally. A significant portion of this waste is handled by the informal sector, which comprise thousands of unregistered recyclers, scrap dealers, and manual workers operating in densely populated urban areas like Silampur, that is in Delhi, Muradabad in Uttar Pradesh, and Chennai in Tamil Nadu. The other thing is related with the crude recycling method. Informal e-waste handlers rely on the primitive techniques such as open burning, acid leaching, and the manual dismantling to extract valuable metal like copper, gold, and silver. These practices release toxic substances such as lead, mercury, toxin, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons into the air, water, and soil. Workers, including children, are exposed daily to hazardous chemicals without protective gear, leading to severe respiratory, neurological, and reproductive health issues. Other factor is related with the livelihood dependency. Despite its environmental health hazards, e-waste recycling supports the livelihoods of an estimated 3 lakh informal workers in India. These workers operate at the bottom of the economic pyramid with little access to education, alternate employment, or healthcare facilities. For many, this informal economy is the only means of survival, making a transition to safe and formalize a practice socially and economically complex. And the last one is related with the regulatory blind spot. India introduced the e-waste management rule in 2011, revised in 2016 and 2022, which maintained extended producer responsibility, that is EPR, and the formal channeling of e-waste. However, enforcement remained weak. Informal recyclers are not integrated into the formal waste chain, and the most e-waste still bypasses registered processing centers. Regulatory bodies often lack the capacity, infrastructure, or a political will to monitor informal operation or ensure compliance, resulting in a regulatory blind spot. Overall, this case highlights the pollution justice trade-off in the informal economy, where the marginalized group bear the brunt of the pollution exposure while being excluded from the environmental protection framework. Bridging this gap requires inclusive policy approach that integrate informal workers into the formal sector, improve enforcement of the environmental laws, and invest safer technologies. Let us now explore the impact of small and medium enterprises challenges in the Polluter-pay principle. India is the home of approximately 63.4 million small and medium enterprises, that is SMEs, which play a pivotal role in the country's economic fabric. These enterprises contribute around 30% to GDP and account for over 45% of the total exports. Despite their economic significance, India SME faces several environmental and regulatory challenges, particularly in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. Other is regulatory exclusion. Nearly 70% of SMEs operate informally outside the scope of formal industrial and environmental regulation, that is International Finance Corporation (IFC). Many of these enterprises functions in the rural and semi-urban areas, often without proper registration, making it difficult for environmental regulatory bodies to monitor or engage them effectively. These informal nature results in minimal adherence to pollution control norms, waste disposal guidelines, or emission standards. The other is now related with the resource constraint. Approximately 85% of SMEs lack of financial or technical resources to invest in the modern environmental compliance infrastructure such as effluent treatment plant, that is ETP, emission control system, or renewable energy alternative, that is CISME sustainability report has pointed out this. High cost, limited credit access, and weak institutional support deter them from pursuing green technology. Further, many SME owner remains unaware of environmental regulation or sustainability practice, compounding the compliance gap. Overall, collectively, environmental risk for SME exert significant environmental footprints, particularly in higher polluting sectors like textile, leather, chemical, and metal finishing. Without targeting policy support, capacity building, and access to green finance, the SME sector risks become a bottleneck in India's journey towards a sustainable industrial development. Now we shall compare the regulatory model with India versus developed nation. And the first parameters we are going to do is regulatory independency. In India, the regulatory bodies often faces political interference which can undermine their autonomy and effectiveness. This contrasts sharply with the developed nations like EU and the US, where the regulatory agency typically enjoy a higher degree of institutional autonomy. This independence also allows them to enforce regulation more consistently and without undue influence from political entities. The next parameter is related with the enforcement resources. India enforcement resources are severely constrained with one inspector responsible for over 100 facilities. This limitation hampers effective monitoring and enforcement of regulation. In developed nations, enforcement agencies are better resourced with one inspector typically overseeing 25 to 50 facilities. This allows more thorough inspection and better compliance with the regulatory standard. The next parameter is related with the penalty determination. The penalty structure in India often involves fixed, low absolute amount. These penalties may not be sufficient to deter non-compliance, especially for large corporations. In contrast, developed nations employ a proportional penalty system where fines are determined based on the harm caused and the economic benefits derived from the non-compliance. This approach ensures that the penalties are significant enough to discourage violation and promote adherence to regulation. Next parameter is related with the monitoring technology. India's regulatory framework relies heavily on the periodic manual sampling with limited automation. This can lead to a gap in monitoring and delay detection of non-compliance. Developed nations, however, utilize advanced continuous emission monitoring systems. These systems provide a real-time data and enable more effective oversight of regulatory compliance. Other parameter is related with the information transparency. Access to information in India is often restricted, with the data fragmentation being a common issue. This lack of transparency can hinder public awareness and accountability. Developed nation mandates public disclosure of regulatory information, making data accessible through structured database. This transparency fosters greater trust in regulatory processes and enable informed decision making by the stakeholders. And the last parameter we are going to discuss is related with the community involvement. Community involvement in India tends to be procedural rather than substantive. While there are mechanisms for public participation, they often lack meaningful engagement and impact. In developed nations, structured mechanism for community involvement ensure that public input is considered in regulatory decision. This leads to more inclusive and effective regulatory framework. Here we discuss by comparing environmental protection approach with their aspect for Polluter-pay principle. The first aspect is related with the primary liabilities. The Polluter-pay principle places direct liabilities on the polluter for environmental damage. This means that those responsible for pollution are financially accountable for the cost of managing and mitigating its impact. In contrast, the government pay principle assigns primary liability to the government, which is responsible for funding and implementing environmental protection measures. The next aspect is related with the victim compensation. Under the Polluter-pay principle, victim compensation depends on the identification and solvency of the polluter. If the polluter cannot be identified or lacks the financial resources, compensation may be delayed or insufficient. GPP, that is government pay principle, however, ensure prompt and guaranteed compensation as the government assumes responsibility for addressing environmental harm regardless of the polluter financial status. The next aspect is related with the monitoring incentives. The Polluter-pay principle provides a lower incentives for the government monitoring as the financial burden of non-compliance falls on the polluter. This can lead to less rigorous enforcement of environmental regulation. Conversely, the government pay principle offers higher government incentives for monitoring and enforcement as the government bears the financial cost of the environmental damage. This approach encourages more proactive and stringent oversight. The other aspect is related with the care incentives. The care incentives under Polluter-pay principle direct but limited by the wealth of the polluter. Wealthy polluter may invest in the pollution control to avoid penalty, while the poorer polluter may struggle to comply. The government pay principle provides indirect care incentives which can be stronger for the poor agent. Since the government is responsible for environmental protection, it may implement broader measures that benefits all polluters regardless of their financial capacity. And the last aspect is related with the optimal context. The Polluter-pay principle is most effective in contexts where the polluters are wealthy and judicial systems are efficient. Wealthy polluters can afford to pay for the damage they cause and efficient court can enforce penalty effectively. The government pay penalty system, on the other hand, is optimal in scenario where the polluters are financially constrained and the courts are inefficient. By placing the financial responsible on the government pay system ensures that environmental protection measures are consistently funded and implemented regardless of the polluter financial capacity. In conclusion, both the government pay principle and Polluter-pay principle have their strength and weakness, and the choice between them depend on the specific economic and institutional context. The Polluter-pay principle is suitable for wealthy polluters and efficient judicial system, while the government pay principle is better for the financial constrained polluter and less effective courts. By understanding these differences, policymakers can design more effective environmental protection strategies tailored to their unique circumstances. Now we shall describe about the new policy innovation that is beyond the traditional approach on the Polluter-pay principle in India. India has already strengthening the Polluter-pay principle by defining clear legal definition by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and the Climate Change, developing guidelines, robust valuation method by NURIs, that is National Environmental Engineering Research Institute, transparent governance clearly defined by the Parivesh portal by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and the Climate Change, and the equitable implementation largely governed by the policy made by the NITI Aayog, that is National Institution for Transforming India. Now the question arises, what are the new policy innovation beyond these four traditional approach? Today, the Polluter-pay principle has been a foundational doctrine in Indian environmental governance. Evolving ecology challenges and the complex socio-economic dynamics demand more innovative and integrated policy mechanisms. Moving beyond punitive framework, India is increasingly exploring policy innovation that incorporates market instrument, transparency mechanism, judicial intervention, and the community involvement. Let us see one by one. The first is related with the market-based instrument. India has begun adopting market-based solutions such as emission trading scheme, that is ETS, and the green taxes to incentives pollution reduction. The performance achieved and the target, that is PET scheme under the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, as the emission trading pilot in Surat for particulate matters control are pioneering example. These systems encourages industries to innovate while internalizing the environmental cost. The next is related with the information disclosure. Environmental compliance is increasingly tied to the transparency and the public access to information. Then the environmental impact assessment, notification, and the Parivesh portal provide a digital platform for the real-time monitoring environmental clearance status and the stockholders' feedback that the Parivesh portal is depicting. This fosters the accountability and the public participation in the environmental decision making. The next is related with the judicial activism. Indian courts, particularly the Supreme Court and the National Green Tribunal, that is NGT, have actively enforced Polluter-pay principle through landmark ruling and judgment. In case such as Vellore Citizen Welfare Forum versus Union of India, the judiciaries have expanded Polluter-pay principle scope to include precautionary and sustainable development principle. The next is related with the collaborative governance. The environmental governance transitioning from top to down to a collaborative model involving coordination between the government agency, private players, and the civil society. Initiatives like National Clean Air Program and Swachh Bharat Mission demonstrate the importance of multi-sector engagement. The next is related with the community-based monitoring, that is the most important one. Local communities and NGOs are playing growing role in monitoring pollution, reporting violation, and shaping grassroots environmental action. Models such as community-based water quality monitoring, waste audit, offer real-time data and empower citizens to demand accountability. With this, we draw the curtains on our comprehensive series on the Polluter-pay principle, an essential yet often under-enforced pillar of environmental governance. Before we move into our upcoming discourse, let us briefly recapitulate the insight shared in today's concluding session. We explore the fall of Polluter-pay principle in the developing country with focus lens on India's regulatory and socio-economic landscape. The key segment included an examination of the textile industries in Tamil Nadu, mining operation in Goa, and pollution emanating from the informal sector, all of which illustrated the deep-rooted challenges in enforcing the liability and ensuring accountability of small and medium enterprises challenges. We also undertook a comparative evaluation of Indian environmental regulatory model via developed nations, identify systematic gap and diverging enforcement mechanism. Further, we reflected on alternative environmental protection approach, highlighting the stark contrast in legal and institutional responses across the jurisdictions. The session concluded with a forward-looking discussion on the policy innovation, advocating a shift from the punitive framework to market-based instruments, collaborative governance, and the community-driven monitoring system, all critical for Regenerating Environmental Accountability in India. As this series comes to an end, we invite our viewers to stay engaged as we embark on new month-long series exploring the energy sector in India. In the interim, we encourage you to delve into our upcoming discussion on India's Green Credit Program, followed by an exploration of countries' evolving waste management rules. Until then, we wish you a pleasant and enriching summer break.